Welcome to another talk on Springfield's history. Today we'll be focusing on Springfield's first country club and the area that surrounded it, the Delaware area. This presentation is brought to you today by me, Richard Crabtree, Realtor. I work with Murney Associates. I specialize in the sale of historic real estate pre-1970. So if you're looking for somebody to help buy or sell an older home and or would like to know its history and how to restore it, I would love to help you out. Please give me a call. On to the presentation. Well, the land that was owned in this area in 1876, most of it was owned by our past governor, John S. Phelps. John owned this along with C.M. Bennett and George Dello. And Mr. Dello had a smaller section. He had a dairy farm. It was a hobby farm for him. By 1904, things are starting to change. Mr. Phelps had passed away, and his daughter had married Colonel Montgomery, and they owned still a sizable amount of land. Hugh McLaren had acquired a section and called it Rose Hill. That was a dairy farm. Mr. Bennett had a smaller lot, but still a sizable 40 acres. And then, of course, we have George Dello had his dairy farm to the north. A new name we see on there is William H. Johnson. We'll be talking about him shortly. By 1920, things are starting to look a little bit more familiar. We have Sanford Place up there by Delmar, Hawthorne, Meadowmere, Country Club District. Now on the Country Club, we can actually see the approximate location of the lake. We see Fast Night Creek flowing from there, and it's just south of Bennett is where the lake really was, but they've got it north here. The Country Club itself, Country Club Place, and Sagamore. Sagamore and Sagamore Hill were directly opposites of University Heights. And we can see things a little bit better on this picture, as we can see now the Country Club grounds. Everything's kind of what you expect. One place you'll notice up there in the northwest corner is a place called Bellamy Place on Meadowmere between Fremont and National. That does not have that name. You've seen the columns, and we'll be talking about that later in the presentation. And then down south, you can see Lenox. That would be Sunshine. And then we would have University, where Stanford's listed. Kingsbury would be Stanford, and then, of course, Portland. This is a great shot. This was of National, taken sometime in the 20s, and we are looking down National through all these beautiful trees. And this was 6065, which is just absolutely hard to believe, but it's just stunningly beautiful. So quiet and serene. But we have to remember at the time the city limits was at National and Grand in 1910, and it only extended down to Sunshine and Glenstone in 1926. The Country Club was the first one in Springfield. It was on the Bennett Farm. This is actually the Bennett Farmhouse, and they had added on to it and added the porch, added a kitchen, and some other things onto the back. And this was a beautiful, beautiful location, and just with it being kind of like in the very far southeast part of Springfield, it was a wonderful spot to come to and just relax and enjoy and not hear anything. The Country Club was started in 1906 by Mr. Bixby, Blackwell, Johnson, and Woodruff, like I mentioned before, on the Bennett Farm. We can see the lake, this little road coming down through here. This is what we now call Bennett, and that bridge it would be also part of Bennett. It angled up to the northeast, and did not go straight through to Glenstone, but that would change later. Around 1906, the Country Club was incorporated. William A. Bixby was the president. He would have his house at the southeast corner of Pickwick and Catalpa. And then we have F.G. Blackwell was treasurer, Mr. William H. Johnson, developer of Meadowmere Place. He was the secretary. And then, of course, John T. Woodruff was the attorney. The Country Club itself was on Meadowmere to the north, Glenstone to the east, Portland to the south, and Delaware to the west. Membership was limited to 100 patrons or families. They figured about 5 people per family, so about 500 patrons at $25 a year would bring in a whopping total of $2,500 a year to maintain the property. This photo is a bridge that's actually going over. This is actually Bennett traversing the lake. What's interesting is in the background there, you can actually see the Bentley house, Roseanne and John Bentley's house, which is actually owned by Ava Milligan at the time. This was taken about 1911. Well, the folks at the country club, specifically Mr. Woodruff, was well connected and knew lots of people around the country, and he had reached out to the Curtiss Aeroplanes Company and asked them, since he got wind that they were going to be flying this way, if they would stop in our fair city for a couple of days and show people their wonderful aircraft. Maybe somebody would be interested. And since the country club wasn't that old and it was beautiful grounds and somewhat flat, they opted to do so. And it was an incredible sight. You have to imagine that some of these people had just came to Springfield in horse and wagons and trains, and to have a flightless, a way to fly with just this motor had to just be an incredible sight. Here's a picture of it on the country club grounds, and there's lots and lots of people flocked here. It was funny, they told nobody to bring their horse because this contraption, could scare the horses and cause a stampede. So they had to come out by automobile or walk. The country club lake, as you've seen in some of the earlier stuff, was quite large. They stocked it with anything that they could get their hands on. They had no idea what was going to survive here. So they reached out to the Frisco and had them bring in these massive metal milk containers filled with fish from different breeders around the country, and just dumped it in and hoped something survived, which was kind of funny because most of the patrons didn't fish in it, but the kids enjoyed it. Unfortunately, this lake met the same fate that the lake in Phelps Grove Park did. It started to get bacteria and sewage, seepage, so forth into it, and the bacteria count got too high. So around 1928, they decided finally to drain it. The CWA, one of FDR's groups that they had, like the CCC and WPA, they came in 1934, and they started to rework that old lake bed and make it part of the country club, put down sod, take out trees, do different things. And they did a wonderful job. You would never even know there was a lake there. But this is one of the reasons why I like being a historical realtor, so I can share with people when they're looking at property where water may be. And in this particular spot, we see this massive area that they have decided to cover up Fast Night Creek so it can run underground. And it runs from Glenstone all the way up to Delaware, and you see that more so in this photograph of the country club taken in 1936. You can see how they were burying it, and you can see the outline of the old lake. Then we can also see in this photo they had like a little racetrack out there, and then of course just the expanse of the country club itself. Well, the country club had a little problem. They had fires out here, and as I've talked in some of my other talks, Springfield seems to always have fires, and they're so far away from downtown, there's no way a fire truck could make it out this way and put anything out. So the first one burned down. They rebuilt it with this particular one that we see, and it lasted into the 30s, and then it also would burn down. Golf fees out there at the time were a whopping 35 cents. And you could pay a 40 cents cover charge for a nice night of dancing out there. And chicken and steak dinners were $1. This country club started to run into competition as Mr. Woodruff would build Hickory Hills out on his farm in Cherry Street. And the folks here, they would open up the country club really to anybody. Here we see a nice group of women that decided to come out and play. And they were just as competitive and liked playing with their husbands. And but this was starting to wane here because the Hickory Hills was truly the country. And so many houses were starting to be built up around the country club that this didn't seem like we were really getting away anymore. So we were starting to experience the waning popularity of this particular country club. Although in the 30s they did build the largest version of it, and it was beautiful. Unfortunately, in 1939, as its predecessors, it too succumbed to a chicken grease fire in the kitchen and burnt to the ground. We'll be addressing this area a little bit later on in the talk. Well, I've spoken about William Howard Johnson many times, and here he is again. It seems like him and John T. Woodruff are always creep into my presentations because they had such an impact on the development of Springfield. He had received most of his money and experience and his passion for selling real estate and land down in Forsyth, Missouri. He developed quite a reputation as an honest broker of transactions of land. And so it did not go to waste on the folks in Springfield, as the people that own Pickwick Place and Hawthorne Place reached out to him and said, would you consider coming back to Springfield and living up here and then selling this land for us? And he did, and he was very successful at it, and so much so that he got enough money to buy the land that would become Meadowmere Place. And he also helped with the country club, and he also built the town of Hollister. So all this was going on about the same time. He built himself a beautiful kind of an arts and crafts / farmhouse there on the property. His house was located on the northwest corner of Weller and Meadowmere. It was the first house to be built there. And his family also had a barn where he kept a lot of equipment. They had this pergola that he built there on Weller. We see his wife and family up there in the corner. Sarah Elizabeth Bessie Woods Johnson is his wife, and she would be the mother of 5 of their children. 6, I'm sorry. And Elizabeth loved living out there. It was nice and quiet. But she could go to the country club and then have friends over, and it was just a great place to be. 1907 is when they officially laid out Meadowmere Place, and it would be bound by Catalpa, Fremont, Pickwick, and Meadowmere. By 1909, they added on a second edition, which is their first edition, extending down Meadowmere, picking up Weller, and then going over to Delaware. In 1937, there was actually a third edition, or called second edition, extending down Pickwick to Bennett Street. And we have to thank Mr. Johnson for utilizing the good old Missouri stones, which we have a lot of, and he built this wall around Meadowmere Place with these pillars, and those would be where they would hang the gates to keep some, in earlier years, keep their goats in there. But they would be decorative. Today, when you drive by, you see the metal eye hooks, but you don't see the wooden gates anymore, of course. When he built his house, they did not really pave in there, so it was just kind of dirt that you would drive down and grass, as you can see in that lower picture. Since it's the Kickapoo Prairie, he had to go in and plant a lot of trees. And this is a great photo of his house, an early one, in the winter, and you can see all these trees that he planted. He planted about, like I said, 150 different varieties through there, again, trying to see what would take and to try to make his land more valuable. He was quite the artist. His pop was a retired captain during the Civil War, and he got into photography and shot many of our panoramics and stereo pictures that we have of downtown Springfield in the 1870s and 80s. And he picked up doodling and sketching and really enjoyed it. He actually was the one who we credit for drawing the Governor Phelps homestead there in Phelps Grove Park. Well, he sketched out what his pergola was going to be like, and voila, he built it. And he had these beautiful vines that grew all over it, and it was lush and lovely to see in the summertime. We actually see the entry where he let all this wisteria grow over the top of it there off of Catalpa. And then, of course, in this picture, we're looking we're at Weller, looking up Catalpa, and we can actually see 1151 South Pickwick. It was built back in 1908. And that just towers out there because, again, there's just nothing out there, just a handful of trees and lots of prairie. The bottom picture we see there is there on Weller with the pergola with the suns. And finally, we get to see one of these wooden gates I was telling you about. So next time you're driving down Pickwick or you're on Delaware or Catalpa, look on those pillars and you'll see these metal eye hooks that those gates used to hang on. And then the house itself went under considerable changes over the years because when they decided that they were going to be the ones developing and selling Phelps Grove Park, Mr. Johnson's son, William Wood Johnson, came up here and they built a house over in Phelps Grove. And about the same time, they added stone pillars on this house and had a stone fireplace, and then took the three dormers and made one big shed dormer across the front. He would stay in this house till around 1927. He'd sold it to Vern and Louise Moore. He managed Willow Springs Creamery, and she was involved with the PEO club, and they were having a meeting there in front. This picture was taken on the side of the house. Today, the house is still there. It is more of a Tudory-looking style. It's had lots of additions added on. It's still a lovely home there on the corner. Well, Mr. Johnson took all that stonework that he did in Meadowmere Place, and he took it down to Hollister. And so when he built the English Inn and they built some of the bridges and retaining walls and different things, he even had them build the train station, which is still standing there. It's the only stone train station the Missouri Pacific had on their line. And then he took that same stonework over to Phelps Grove Park. And our bridges, again, were based after what was being built down there in Hollister. He had an entry at the bottom picture. Unfortunately, that was torn down. That was on National. And then, of course, we have the pavilion, which is modeled after the train station. Later years, Mr. Johnson wasn't nearly as active, but he still had a passion for building and real estate. And they got involved with a little project called Tiny Town. And he wanted the kids after World War I to get a profession, learn something besides just schooling. And so he was instrumental in getting a shop department put in at Springfield High School, now Central High School. And all these kids built all these buildings, and on the inside they ran plumbing and wiring. They learned how to basically build a house in the grand scale. What was interesting about it was the city of Springfield wanted nothing to do with it. Several other cities reached out to him, one in particular, Pittsburgh, and they wanted to have it on display. Well, once Springfield heard that Pittsburgh wanted it, well, then suddenly they found a spot for it. They put it in White City Park, which is now the home of Assemblies of God. Well, on to some other wonderful homes in Meadowmere Place. Here we are at 1500 or 1306 pre-1948. This is the Milligan Wood Bentley house built in 1910. It is probably one of the grandest homes in all of Springfield. And what's so interesting about this house, Mr. Milligan absolutely adored pipe organ music. And he had a massive pipe organ put into this house. Now, he couldn't play, but they had a contraption, kind of like a record player, kind of like a music box, that they could hook up these records or cylinders to it and have it play, and then it would play the organ, it would play the pipes, and he could listen to music anytime he wanted, which is really cool considering this is 110 years ago. But after he sold the house, the next gentleman decided to go ahead and put in a console for somebody to actually play it. And we can actually see that in this bottom corner in the entry. When you walk in, you'd actually see the console to play the pipe organ. And this house was and is still a stunning, stunning house. $25,000 to build this house in 1910. Now, I have been told by the occupants of the house that when her father owned the home, that a gentleman, a plumber, unfortunately cut through the lines that ran from the console to the pipe organs and spent months trying to figure out how to make it work and couldn't. So in 1948, when they built University Heights Baptist Church, they went ahead and the Canowers donated all the pipe organs to that church. So if you ever go to University Heights Baptist Church and you see all the organs in there, the pipe organs, those were in this house at one time. Kind of catty corner across the street was another beautiful Tudor house, and this one was built as 1535. Later, it was earlier as 1375 East Meadowmere. This was built by Carl Bissman. He did this in 1934. Mr. Bissman was building the best homes he could in 1934 because the wealthiest people in town were his clients at that time, as we were in the lowest building period in Springfield's history. Dr. William Cheek had a lot of stuff brought over from England to be put into the house, and it is quite stunning. Howard Fisk and his family currently live there today. Well, we can't talk about Meadowmere Place without talking about Baby Lloyd Keep. Now, I've talked in great detail about this, so I don't want to go in a long, drawn-out story on this. But with the Keat Holland house, or Holland Keat house, the kidnapping happened while the folks had went over to the country club, and this was at May 31st, 1917, for a spring social. The young boys who were part of the family that ended up kidnapping their son, Buddy Lloyd Keat, they had went to the house several times as they kind of worked as a runner for Her's department store and pretended to be trying to bring something or take something back, making Mrs. Keat go back in the kitchen in the very far back of the house to call down there, which gave them time to scope the house out. And unfortunately, they did kidnap the baby, and the baby would die during its being held hostage from the family. But it was really just a sad thing. These two photos were actually taken the day after, so this would have been like June 1st from 1917. In this picture, we actually see the streetcar line, the Elm Street line, that dead-ended at Catalpa and Pickwick, and in the background you can see the Keat house. The baby was found, unfortunately, at the Crenshaw Mansion in the cistern, and that would be this image over here in the bottom right corner. The mansion itself set where Hy-Vee is today. And the funeral was so large that they could not possibly get them into the funeral parlor, Paxton's funeral parlor. That is where Maria's Mexican restaurant is today. And that would be the building or the section to the south of the entrance, and that was the funeral parlor. So they ended up having it across the street in the Wheeler building, as we like to call it, but at that time, Hers was using it as their furniture and carpet store. Well, on to one of the largest Tudor houses in the entire area. This was built at 1315 South Pickwick. This was by the Compton Wolf family. Started in 1948 and finished up around 1950. It took a long time because this house has a third floor, and that whole third floor is a ballroom. We see the beautiful, beautiful detail that they put into this house, both in wallpaper and painting and stenciling and so forth. What's funny is you'll notice there's no hardwoods. And, well, why is that? Well, that's because the in-chic thing to do around 1950 was to have expensive wool carpeting ran throughout your house. And that's what they did. So the house recently has received hardwoods from the current owner as he's been restoring the property. And it is just, like I said, a stunning, stunning property. So Hampton and Betty Compton Wolf, Mr. Wolf was the president of Compton Lumber Company. And they were the ones responsible for building this massive, beautiful home. And it's still a beautiful home today. Many people admire it as they drive down Pickwick. Well, I had mentioned earlier there's a Country Club Place. That was laid out in 1909. The Country Club Place, for whatever reason, never really took off till after the war. A handful of houses were built on it off of Delaware, not too many, partially due to the lots were just huge. and a lot of people didn't either want the land or they couldn't afford it. Now we get on to Bellamy Place, and this is really a mystery. Laid out in 1910, like I said, it's on Meadowmere between Nashville and Fremont. You've all seen these concrete pillars that have no plaques on them as you drive down the street. Well, the gentleman that owned it, he laid everything out, and it was supposed to be this beautiful high-end neighborhood like you'd see up in St. Louis, and you could close the streets off if you wanted to in the evenings to keep the riffraff out. No dust, no dirt, no smoke, no noise, no trouble. You're like, what? But you got to remember, downtown you had smells. This was before air conditioning, a lot of horses. People didn't bathe as often. Deodorant wasn't a popular thing. So to be out here in the country was a way to kind of get away from the sights and smells of downtown. Well, like I said, by 1912, Mr. Orville Harrison and then and O.H. McMurray, they had everything laid out. But for whatever reason, McMurray had some trouble. What I found was interesting, he built a massive house for himself called Number 7 Bellamy Place, and today is known as 1265 East Meadowmere. Large arts and craft house, lots of beautiful details. For some reason, by 1912, he lost everything. Lost the house, lost the name. What's funny is when you look in the assessor's page at these properties in here, they don't even reference Bellamy Place as a normal subdivision. It's all meets and bounds. So for whatever reason, he was completely stricken from the record. There's a handful of really interesting houses built in here. Charles Rule House, built in 1912 at 1360 East Meadowmere. And he sold it a little later on for $18,000. He was a distributor for Limp Brewing, and he did quite well. He was the main distributor for the Springfield Brewing Company, but of course they closed in 1911, so he jumped over to sell Limp, and then later on he'd be the main distributor for Pabst. Just down the street at 1340, here's another big arts and craft house built in 1918 for Orville Clinton and Ida Calvin. Now, Mr. Calvin actually worked for Turner's department store, and he was one of their big managers there and did quite well. And he decided to get into the more up-and-coming look in the 1930s, and that was to have a Spanish Mission stucco house. So he actually hired a gentleman to come in and add all this stucco to the front of their house and on their fireplace internally. But it's a 1918 arts and craft house with a 1930 Spanish Mission stucco stuck onto it. And then, of course, we have 1254 East Meadowmere. This was built in 1912. Friend Charles and Ida Page. Mr. Page had a concrete and junk company. That's one of the reasons why the entire house is built of concrete and stucco. And the other thing was that he started the Pig and Bun, which we'll be talking about that as well. And in this slide, we can see, if you look, the street running down here, and the bottom is Fremont. And then if you look at the street running from the corner up to the top, that would be Meadowmere. And then we see this rather large circle here, and that was for a house that was built in 1956 for the Bothwells. It was a contemporary kind of Frank Lloyd Wright mid-century house, and they had a massive amount of land back there, almost a big L or a hockey stick kind of looking plot. Well, on to Country Club District in Ugland Terrace, and this was really the neighborhood that really hurt Phelps Grove Park. They were both being laid out in 1912, and the only difference was John Woodruff was the one promoting and dealing with this particular piece of property that he bought from Dr. George Dello. And what was interesting is that he decided to mimic his property more along the lines of stuff he saw in St. Louis. And it was bound by Grand, Glenstone, Meadowmere, and Delaware. Now, Glenstone was a name he came up with. He thought at that time, when you looked across the street, it reminded him of Ireland. And so that's where we get Glen and Stone. There's lots of stones, and he thought it looked like a glen, so why not? Incidentally, the name Kentwood is a name that was he derived from taking his best friend's part of his last name, Kent, and part of his last name, Woodruff, and put it together and came up with Kentwood. He would build the largest home in that subdivision, and that was the first home that he built really in there, and that was something that he was hoping to move into, except his wife hated it. This big, monstrous, like English castle. And so before it was done, Charles Martin, who owned Martin's Piano Store downtown, he approached him and made him an offer he could not refuse. And they acquired the property. Here's a picture of it after about 5 or 10 years, letting all the ivy kind of grow up on it. But this is just this big open expanse, and of course it looks directly south into the country club. Well, the Martin family, Charles didn't get to enjoy it too terribly long. He fortunately died in 1936. His wife Louise, she stayed in the home, but she tried selling it in 1952 for it to become our first big standalone art museum. But then they thought, well, it's kind of too far from a lot of other things. It's not near a park or anything, and they thought it may become landlocked, so they passed. 1954, it did find a new owner. His name is Ralph Foster. Ralph Foster moved KWTO Studios from downtown out to this building, and they would enjoy a long life here. Now the home of Hyde, Love, and Overby attorneys. And it's nestled in between a billboard and a parking lot and a big building. But if you slow down on Glenstone, you'll see the house. And what's so interesting is just to imagine all the beautiful lush land and trees that used to be to the south of it that you could see from this home. Well, Mr. Woodruff had to move somewhere, so he decided that he would contact Gustav Stickley, the Stickley Furniture Company, who is really the biggest proponent of the arts and craft movement in the United States, and asked him, would you design a house for me? He picked the next choice lot, which was right at Catalpa and Kentwood, and he laid out this beautiful low-lying arts and craft bungalow. And we were blessed because the drawings and pictures of it are all available up in New York at Columbia University, and that's where the Stickley collection ended up. And so some of the drawings of the house were actually put in one of Stickley's magazines, and so we were able to see that. There's John down there with his young family about the time that they moved into the house. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Ralph Foster had bought the Charles Martin house for the studios, and he wanted to live close by to work, so he came along and acquired Woodruff's house, and they added a massive addition onto it. The house basically was a charming 3-bedroom house, but they took the third bedroom and added on about 30 feet and added on a big walk-in closet and a master bath. And they enclosed the porch and added some metal work and different things on it because they were big art collectors and antique collectors, and they wanted a place to store all their goodies. Here in this picture, if you look over in the middle of the picture on the far left, you can actually see the KWTA Studios or Martin House and all the land that was around it looking south into the country club. And you also get a good idea of seeing what was built at the time. It's interesting, on Catalpa, the only house that was really built at the time at that corner of Kentwood and Catalpa was the house that was built for Billy Long's grandfather. And then, of course, across the street there would be the Woodruff house. And then all the houses that were built on Catalpa, several Bisman houses in there. And not much to the south. One of my favorite houses that was built was Mr. Tolliver. T.J. Tolliver built a lot of brick homes. He built a few others, but mainly he was a brick builder. And this one at 1600 East Catalpa was actually built as a spec house for a whopping sum of $10,000. Always admired this house. It's such a beautiful, beautiful home. And then here at 1642 or 1424, when it was built this is on East Catalpa, not South, by Carl Bisman in 1937. This is the Moody House. And this is funny about this house. It seemed like the newspapers absolutely loved this house because I've got multiple articles where they would go back here again and again and photograph this house and do write-ups on it. It is unique. This was considered to be a modern Georgian colonial. Well, Sagamore Hill, this was a more affordable neighborhood for the higher-end blue-collar and up-and-coming white-collar folks. It was laid out in 1912 and again in 1913. Now, where in the world would they come up with the name Sagamore Hill? Well, it came from Teddy Roosevelt. Why did Teddy Roosevelt have anything to do with it? Well, at the time, Teddy had been president for 2 terms and ended up deciding he was not going to run again and changed his mind later. And he ended up running for the Bull Moose Party at this time. And so he was quite popular. So the folks decided that they would name the subdivision after his house up in New York. And they called it Sagamore Hill. And this is what it looked like in 1912. And the lots were absolutely massive. And needless to say, they were not selling at all. So they chopped them up into little bitty lots in 1913, and they did much better. What's interesting is we still have 4 streets here. Lenox, which is Sunshine, Stanford, Kingsbury, and Country Club. And that's not the way the subdivision would be chopped up. So it would have a different look later on. Here's an ad for it from 1913. $10 down and $10 a month. This picture and the next will give you a little bit better idea. You can see just this was taken in the 30s. I mean, how sparse it was out here. There was not a lot of anything out here, and especially between Delaware and Glenstone. The Country Club was obviously to the north. There was not much to the west of Delaware, and University Heights was still fairly new. So there was just this was just a nice, peaceful place to come to. Now, this Sanborn map kind of tells you a story that's kind of unique about Sagamore Hill. We see Sunshine, we see University, but what we don't see is Kingsbury. Well, you see Stanford and Kingsbury. What happened, which was a unique problem, they decided when they were building on this street for a while it would be called Stanford, and then they decided that any of the houses on the south side of that street would be Stanford, and all the houses on the north side of the street would be called Kingsbury. Now, that would just confuse the living daylights out of anybody. So finally, they decided by 1948 that, we're just going to lose Kingsbury, and it would just be called Stanford. And then Country Club Lane would become Portland. Mr. Bisman built several homes in here, and this one at 1315, or originally as 1211 East University, built by Mr. Anderson, for Mr. Anderson. This was his Model T home. This was the exact replica of a house that he built for himself up on Johnson Street up in North Springfield, and incidentally, the same size house he died in. They built these all over Springfield. If you really study this with the rock fireplace in the front, you'll see these over and over and over again. And typically there were 2 bedrooms. Sometimes there would be 3. And they were just charming houses. Quality built. It's just they were small and very few changes were made. But if you wanted a Bisman home but you couldn't afford the top notch, this is what you got. Then this is kind of fun. This is, again, another reason why I enjoy doing this research when I'm trying to help people buy and sell houses. I think you would like to know that if you were buying this house, that the walls were 14 to 16 inches thick of concrete. Would kind of impede you from doing a lot of just quickie work on it. This house was built as 1019 East Kingsbury, but it's now 1315 East Stanford, explaining that difference earlier. And this was actually built in 1941. Ashley Koenig designed it and built it, and for Ralph and Nelila Dighton. They lived in there for just a little while. It's interesting, some of these houses, when you see these early ones, especially if they're smaller and that, it seems as the families would move in, and every about 2 to 3 years, people would move out and get a bigger house. Well, this was a great starter neighborhood, and a lot of unique styles in there. Just as this one, this was a nice little house built at 1439 East Stanford. Also, it used to be 1115 East Kingsbury, built in 1940. And this was built for Wilford and Eva Killingsworth, and it was built by Lawrence Moberly. And again, a very charming house, and they would put in the paper, colors and styles and how everything was laid out. It's always fun to drive by and see if these houses are still like this today. This gives you a better overview of what the area looked like post-World War II. This is the country club. Of course, the country club is gone, and they started developing in there quite a bit. Just to the south of Meadowmere on Delaware, there were several houses built, and it's interesting that pretty much all that whole street, they do not have a subdivision lot number. They're meets and bounds. This was built for the Sawyers. It was a massive limestone house, and it has these beautiful, really cool gas lamps that are circular on the front of the house. Mr. Monroe L. Sawyers, he had his house built by Glenn Magruder. Mr. Magruder was one of the few, along with Thompson and a couple of other people, that were Bisman copycats. And so a lot of people look at their homes and go, that has to be a Bisman home. And typically it's one of the other builders. This one I thought was always kind of interesting. This reminds you of the Deep South or Terra. This was built in 1940 for Claude Herndon. It was built after Washington's Mount Vernon. That was the style they wanted. Dr. John and Mary Hammond lived here. And it was funny, I've heard stories about this pool that he used spring water to fill it. So it would be icy, icy cold, but probably a little refreshing if it was 100 degrees out. Well, the first subdivision that was laid out in the old country club happened in 1941. Remember, it burned in 39, so it kind of sat empty. And this was actually south of Portland, so this is pretty far south. And this one basically had one house built into it, and then we had this little thing called World War II breakout. This was one of the houses that was built down that way at 1636, previously 1596 South Delaware, built in 1941 for Harry and Mary Howard. The grill work that you can kind of see there in front door, they came off the old Holland mansion that was over at St. Louis and Kimbrough. It's unfortunately gone, but that's where the right across the street there is the the hamburger place, and I'm drawing the blank. Sorry about that, folks. But now it's the American Legion home, and that's what I was trying to say, but that's at St. Louis and Kimbrough. So we get several different country clubs, estates that are laid out, or different subdivisions. First edition, the Country Club Estates, and we get the second edition. Then we get Dunaway's Country Club Estates and his second edition. You can actually see in this bottom one where the water traverses down Fairway over towards Delaware. And you start getting all sorts of different styles. This was a very popular kind of salt box colonial that was built post-war. A lot of times some of the houses that were built after the war were a little simpler, still trying to get the supplies up that we once had. Homer and Florence DeBerry moved here. Mr. DeBerry was big in the Frisco Railroad, and this house is still there today. By 1961, you can see a massive change. We can look over here on Delmar and Catalpa and see there's a lot more houses now built past Delaware, where that earlier picture showed virtually nothing on Catalpa. And then we can look down and start to see that they are building businesses along Glenstone in the country club area as well. And this is kind of a fun picture because if you ever drive down Portland has kind of a hook to it now. But if you would look where that hook is kind of going, that's where Steak and Shake would eventually be sitting. And the little swirls over there in the corner, that happens to be the drive-in theater, the first drive-in theater in Springfield. It was off of Sunshine. And this is a view that was taken around 1960. You can actually see Delaware School in there now. You can see a better view of the drive-in theater, and you can see most of the country club area has filled in. Well, over the years, there were multiple schools that served this area. The first one was Pickwick School, and it was laid out in 1908, and it was considered a country school because it was so far from downtown. Drury sent their demonstration teachers down there to kind of learn and try new tricks to get them used to going out to rural schools. And it was interesting because there wasn't a lot of students down this way, but most of the students' families were well off. So the school got treated really, really well, and they got a lot of things that the other schools didn't have. It was the first concrete building built in Greene County. Reed and Heckenlively, he was the gentleman, he's actually, Captain Heckenlively was the gentleman responsible for getting the American Legion built up there on Kimbrough and St. Louis. And he ended up being paid a whopping $7,000 is what it was going to cost to build this thing. 3 rooms, 49 by 49 feet, story and a half. It opened on October 5th, 1908, and had 87 students. So it was quite an interesting structure. I'm sure everybody was shocked, but it was supposed to be progressive. And when you looked on the inside, it was really neat, but they had like a shop crafting artsy room, and then you also notice on the corner there's a bunch of hoes and rakes and shovels because they had their own garden, and the kids gardened and learned all sorts of stuff. So it's a little bit different than today, but I'm sure most of the kids would have enjoyed it. 1908, they won a contest and won this American flag. And partially due again to the wealth of their parents, they were able to outraise even all of Central High School, if you can believe that, or Springfield High School as it was called at that time. Well, by 1915, they really decided they needed a new school, and it was still supposed to be called Pickwick as they were doing it. But in that 1916-17 time frame, there was a big push to change all the school names to names referring to people who were instrumental in the development of the school system. And so it would become N.M. Roundtree when it was finished. And it was completed officially in 1918. O.L. Bettern of Drury designed it in 1916. It was going to cost a whopping $40,000, so quite a bit more than the old Pickwick School. And incidentally, the Pickwick School sold for scrap for $500. This was going to hold 600 students, and they had their grand opening in January of 1918. We can see here what was interesting when they built the school, they actually built it on the playground for Pickwick School. And then once it was done, then they tore down the Pickwick School, and it became the playground for the Roundtree School. And these pictures were taken in 1921. If you look at the top one over in the far corner, that's my neighborhood, Sanford Place. Just trees that Mr. Sanford had planted in there. There wasn't much else. And they were just starting to build. And same thing, if we look at the bottom one, we're looking over towards Fremont, and not a lot over there. If you look over in that far picture, you can see them going down Grand, and there's just nothing but trees. It's amazing. And then, of course, the kids here, they just had constantly were having all sorts of fun little get-togethers and parties and so forth. The thing I got a kick out of this last picture down here, it was taken in 1925, and the principal was also teaching at the time. She had 60 kids in one class. Oh, if you could only do that today. Well, Roundtree, of course, almost faced closure. In 1982, a lot of the parents got together and fought to keep it open, and they were quite successful. Became part of the IB program, and currently has about 250 students today. And it just recently has celebrated 100 years in the neighborhood. Delaware School hadn't been around that long. Next, we have Delaware School. It was built in 1951. Or finished in 51, and unfortunately only survived to 2019, so it probably had a shorter lifespan than it should have. Here we can see it being built in 1950, And it's interesting because you look and there's still a fair amount of open space out there. You can look up in the Bellamy Place and you see the Bentley house. You're looking down Fairway and Kentwood. They're starting to build in through there. The big, beautiful homes that are on Delaware across from the school. And you can see them in this view as well as we look down Bennett and over towards Pickwick, and then see all these wonderful homes and their little gardens and stuff that they have behind them on Delaware. The school, whether you like the design on the outside or not, was as modern could be. And they had their big nurses station. They had a lounge that parents could have conferences in. The classrooms were everything that I remember growing up with. And the kids participated in lots of projects and, of course, had their parents' nights to come visit and see what the kids were doing. And the Bluebirds, which would be kind of like the Girl Scouts, they were planting trees on the property. Well, unfortunately, they decided that it was no longer working for them, so in 2019 it was torn down. And this is what the new Delaware School, when it's completed, will eventually look like. The country club and the shopping center and cats. Well, we are getting ready to head into a whole new era. And we have to thank John Quentin Hammonds, or James as his real name is. James was the one who was responsible for getting a lot of the area zoned into commercial along Glenstone. And we are thankful that he was able to build the development up. Now, he helped Mr. Gillenwater acquire the land to put the subdivisions in, but then he worked on developing all the businesses along Glenstone. And how he got his money, it was interesting. After the war, he had amassed $60,000 and started a company called the Mortarless Concrete Company, Mortarless Masonry. And unfortunately, his partner took him for the money, and he ended up in debt. So he had to reach out to a backer to find a way to develop this Village Gardens, which happens to be on Cinderella, right behind Steak and Shake. There's a whole big area over there where they developed a bunch of duplexes. And they had a small section, and John approached a developer and convinced him that if you would go in this with me, that we'll both make a couple of $100,000 each. And that is exactly what he did. They were FHA inspected. They were for the GI Bill. They were built by Mesher and Hammonds. The Carl Bisman and Dick Stahl were the architects. Meeks did all the lumber, and then Roper did the electric. Paul Mueller was involved. There was just a lot of well-known companies that we know today. And they developed all these in there, and they were actually beautifully built buildings, and they held up exceptionally well. If you drive through there today, they're in wonderful shape. This picture here shows you kind of how it was laid out. And again, it seems kind of out in the country, but the first house where the arrow's pointing there, if you come down Cinderella, that duplex right there, that was John's. Him and his wife lived in the the southern one, and then the northern one was his business office. And he was happy there. He enjoyed building, and he didn't want anything any bigger. He would end up building his house, or his office, across the street, kind of catty corner from Steak and Shake. That's an empty lot now. Apparently, not everybody was crazy about John, because the building would catch fire mysteriously twice. He received a bomb threat, and multiple times people would have taken their cars and driven through the grass in front of the building and peel out and destroy the yard. But he persevered. He did so well with the deal that he was able to build Wedgwood Shopping Center afterwards, and then he helped build the Country Club Shopping Center we see here in this first edition of Country Club. And today, unfortunately, his building is no longer there, but they're getting ready to build something on that spot. And here we see the Country Club Shopping Center, and it's interesting because the buildings, none of them match. Now, from the front, they're pretty symmetrical, But John worked out deals with different people to go in there and build. Each section was sold off to a different person and done a different way. So there's no uniformity at all. And of course, just a little bit further south, we'd end up with Katz moving in, the largest, basically, drugstore in the United States. Unfortunately, it too now is for sale. An A&P grocery store was just to the right of it. Here's some wonderful pictures of the grand opening, and it was a massive. A lot of us have all been in there when it's been different pharmacies over the years. CVS put up a wall, cutting off half of it in later years. So now that's all been ripped down. So we'll be anxious to see who ends up moving in there. Well, we only had a handful of restaurants that were actually in the neighborhood over there, and but we cover barbecue, Italian, and Mexican. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Friend had friend Charles and Ida Page. They had their beautiful house built in Meadowmere Place. Well, in 1928, they would open up this restaurant, and first it was just called Friend Charles Page Restaurant, and then the next year it would become Pig Stand Number One. By 1931, it changed its name to Pig and Bun Stand Number One. And there were three others. They didn't survive. And then Alika Duncan was the vice president, friend Ida's daughter. And then Lynn R. Duncan was secretary and treasurer. And they had it for quite some time, and they had several different owners that would come along after them. 1950, they had a big fire in there, and they lost the kitchen and some other spots. And that's when they rebuilt everything to pretty much the look most people are familiar with today. And soon thereafter, they decided that they would rent the building. And 1951, Garen and Betty Ferguson acquired the restaurant, and they started selling Mexican food. So it's still Pig and Bun, but they're serving Mexican food and pork tenderloins and barbecue sandwiches and just a combination of everything, which I would have enjoyed. And that's why there's big open area where you could sit out there in during the summertime and enjoy and keep the mosquitoes away. Well, then along about 1954, Thomas Lafino, he came along and acquired the place and decided he was going to call it Italian Villa. And he started specializing in pizza and Italian food and so forth. It was the first place in Springfield to sell Spumoni ice cream. And he had a unique advertising thing. There were little sexual innuendos in a lot of his little ads and stuff. But he did quite well and was there up until 1962. Well, this is when things get a little interesting. So Garen and Betty Ferguson decided they were going to come back. They had been on Glenstone, but they thought the national spot would be a lot busier and a better place to improve their business. So they moved back into the Pig and Bun location. But the restaurant they had was called Old Mexico. So why in the world didn't they not just call it Old Mexico? Well, they found out that Mexican and Italian are the same amount of letters, and it was a lot cheaper to change the neon over to Mexican than it was to change it all to Old Mexico. So that's how it became Mexican Villa. So for those of you that go there today, that's where the name came from. The other one, unfortunately, is not in the neighborhood, but still nearby, the Pizza House. In the fall of 1958, J.L. and Dorothy D. Smith, they started the Pizza House there in Glenstone, near the northwest corner of Bennett and Glenstone. And the food was wonderful. It reminded you so much of St. Louis style, kind of like Emo's out of St. Louis. Very, very affordable. $1 to $1.75 at the time to get a large pizza. And it was such a wonderful place because it was a neighborhood pizza place, and they had many chains and different people come and go, but they always survived. And, they had so many regulars, they could spot you walking in and know that you wanted a mushroom sausage pizza and throw it in the oven before you even sat down. And so it was just a beautiful, fun little place, and I was happy to have went there a couple of times. Well, Stacy Schneider had started working with Dee, and she would eventually end up acquiring it before they had spent 50 years in that location. In 2008, there was a big hullabaloo with the gentleman that owned the gas station and the parking lot. So they decided to heave ho and head up north, and that's where they have been since October 31st of 2008. And they've been up there at 312 East Commercial Street. And they have actually grown and doubled their business and their size, and the food's wonderful. And so if you enjoyed the Pizza House, please do go up and visit Stacy and the gang. I'm sure they'd enjoy seeing you. Well, I'm so happy that you've came to yet another history presentation, and as I mentioned before, if you have never joined, please do join the Springfield, Missouri History Landmarks and Vintage Photography page. We are over 20,000 members at this time, and we love to have you involved with our group, share pictures and stories and other anecdotes. Again, thank you ever so much for your support. And I look forward to presenting yet another spot of Springfield history in the very near future.